1 Corinthians chapter 13. As we continue on in this tremendous chapter, and what is a fascinating book to be sure, we're not going to make it far as verses are concerned this morning, and I think you'll see why. But let's go ahead and back up. I know we talked about this last week, but let's go ahead and back up and read verse 1. It says, Paul says, "Though I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, and have not charity, I am become as sounding brass or as tinkling cymbal. And though I have the gift of prophecy and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and though I have all faith so that I could remove mountains, and have not charity, I am nothing. And though I bestow all my goods to feed the poor, and though I give my body to be burned, and have not charity, it profiteth me nothing." And then he goes on to say, where we'll begin this morning, he says, "Charity suffereth long, and is kind. Charity envieth not, and charity vaunteth not itself, is not puffed up, doth not behave itself unseemly, seeketh not her own, is not easily provoked, thinketh no evil, rejoiceth not in iniquity, but rejoiceth in the truth, beareth all things, believeth all things, hopeth all things, endureth all things." Now, I read through verse number 7, and I'll tell you, we're not going to make it through verse 7 this morning. This is going to be kind of a two-part sermon that we'll have to finish up next week. But we begin there with these descriptions in verse number 4. And so I read verses 1, 2, and 3 because it really gives us the context of what we're talking about. So Paul began this section in those verses by explaining the absolute necessity of love. Right? And this is what we discussed last week. As we saw, the love encapsulates all of a Christian life. There's nothing that you and I as a Christian should ever do without love being the lens through which we do it. Right? As we saw in verse number 1, everything we speak, if without love, it's just noise. Right? In verse number 2, he says everything must be done with love in mind. And again, this is in keeping with the very nature of God. John in 1 John tells us two times that God is love. Right? And if you and I are supposed to emulate God, if we're supposed to be his ambassadors, as Paul says, then we ought to correctly show the world what our God is. And if our God is love, then love must be the catalyst of everything that you and I do as Christians. And so showing its importance, and verses 1 through 3 really gives a great foundation. Showing its importance, what Paul does in this section is obvious, right? He defines that love, right? And so he tells us we must have it, and then tells us what it is that we must have. Right? And so he's going to emphasize the characteristics that properly define, as we talked about last week, that agape love, that God-given love. The love that we should have for others, that is the love that God has for you and I. Now, there is something important to note here. Paul isn't just defining love. Now he is, and again, that's obvious in the text, that's obvious as we make our way through it. He's not just defining love, but he's also, in defining it, condemning the actions of the Corinthians. And so something that we'll see, and as I'll try to bring out, and every one of the things that Paul uses to define love is something that is a condemnation of the actions of the Corinthians. And a lot of this we've seen already. And so all of the things that we read that love does, the Corinthians were not doing them, or were very much struggling to do them. All of the things we read that love does not do, the Corinthians were involved with these things. And so again, as we see, it's a condemnation of the Corinthians, which really you could say is defining a sentence of what the book of 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians is all about. It's a condemnation of the church at Corinth. David Garland, he writes this, he says, "Omitting the negatives in each clause leaves us with a good description of the Corinthians' behavior. They are impatient and unkind, filled with jealousy, vainglorious, puffed up. They insist on their own way, are cantankerous and resentful, and rejoice in wrong rather than right." And so again, in the way that Paul describes love is the same things that the Corinthians were struggling with. Now, none of that negates the descriptions, right? That doesn't mean, well, then we can't take full stock in the descriptions, because if Paul's just really condemning the Corinthians, then, right, does that leave us with the proper description of love? It does, right? It does not negate the descriptions. The descriptions in themselves stand. However, what it also does is it stands as a warning to that church, to the church at Corinth, and when it comes to love, this vital aspect of the Christian life that they were found wanting. And so it almost stands as a measure by which you and I should measure ourselves against. Right? We need to look at this kind of thing, and it's easy for us to look 2,000 years ago and say, well, boy, that church was really struggling, and boy, that church had a lot of problems, and yes, they were, and yes, they did. But we got to ask ourselves, well, how do we measure up against this? Right? If we're to take an honest look at ourselves, if we're to ask ourselves, are we really loving the way that we're supposed to? I think, if we're being honest, I think we see that we're going to fall really short of what Paul describes here in these few short verses. And so all in all, Paul gives us 15 characteristics. 15. Now, this is why we're not going to finish this today. Because I didn't want to. I had one of two options. Either I could zoom through this and just give a couple of words about each one, or we could take a few minutes and look at each one in a little more depth. And I didn't think it would do justice to just give a word or two about each, and so we're going to break it down. And this morning we're going to talk about 7 of them. And next week we'll talk about 8. Now, interestingly enough, in those 15 characteristics, 7 of them are things that love does, 8 of them are things that love does not do. Now, that's not how I'm going to break it down. I'm just going to go in order this morning. But when you take all 15 together, 7 are positive, 8 are negative. So taken together, it gives us an amazing look, not only of the depth of the love that Christ has for us, and I do want that to be at the forefront of your mind as we go through this list. This list, what it does in totality is it describes perfectly the way in which Christ loves each and every one of us. And so when we look at this, I don't want you to only think about that. I do want you to think about that, but I also want you to think about the weight of the love that is expected of us. Because not only does this perfectly describe the way that Christ loves us, but it is also giving us the description of the way you and I ought to love each other. And so this is a weighty portion of Scripture, to be sure. Now, as I said last week, I'll say it again this week. People use 1 Corinthians 13 for all kinds of reasons. Probably if you've been to a wedding, you've heard 1 Corinthians 13 at least in part quoted. Now, I'm not saying that that's wrong to do, but what I am saying is that when we look at 1 Corinthians 13 in its context is not love for spouse. It applies, but the context is not love for spouse. The context of 1 Corinthians 13 is the love between Christian brothers and sisters. Right? Chapter 13 is sandwiched between chapters 12 and 14, which, as we have seen and will continue to see in 14, is all about the spiritual gifts and all about how the spiritual gifts should work within the body of Christ and how the spiritual gifts should lead to exhortation. Right? It's all about edifying one another. It's about the love that you and I ought to have for each other. And so when we go through this list, I don't want you to just think about, right, this is how I should be loving my spouse, or this is how I should be loving my children. Let me say again, it applies, right? Do love your spouse that way. Do love your children that way. Do love your coworkers. But what I want you to think about is, within the context, here's what I'm thinking. I ought to be loving everybody in this room this way, not just my spouse. I shouldn't just love Beth this way. I shouldn't just love my kids this way. I should love all of you this way, right? And so this is what we need to be reminding ourselves as we go through this list this morning. And so, with that being said, we're going to look at, I mentioned earlier, we're going to look at the first 7 today, and we'll look at the next 8 next time. But the first 7 characteristics of love. And so verse 4, again, charity, the first one, charity suffereth long. Charity, love is long-suffering. Now, we mentioned last week, and when we were back in chapter 8, charity here, and we've already given the reasons why that word was chosen, but we're talking about love, right? This is the word that we're talking about. So love is patient. Love is patient. That's what he says here. And when he talks about patience here, the word that's used really describes a patience, not so much that, when we're in traffic and somebody cuts us off, that we're not getting mad. We're not talking about that kind of patience. What we're talking about is a patience that with individuals, with people, will take and take and take and take and not quit, not throw in the towel, will not just walk away from the situation. And to me, boy, Paul couldn't have picked a better way to begin this list. Because as I was thinking through this, if our relationships, not only with one another in the church, but in every relationship we have, if our relationships, if the way we loved actually loved with patience, think about how much our relationships would be revitalized. Think about how many conflicts could be avoided. If we could just simply say, you know what, it doesn't matter your actions do not determine and dictate the way I love you. I think it would change a lot. I think there'd be a whole lot more marriages that didn't end in divorce. I think there'd be a whole lot less churches splitting apart. I think there would be a whole lot more relationships mended or never even conflicts to begin with if people could just genuinely say, I will love with patience. Paul said to the church in Ephesians, he said, I, therefore, the prisoner of the Lord, beseech you that you walk worthy of the vocation wherewith you are called, with all lowliness and meekness, with long-suffering, forbearing one another in love. Same context. Within the Christian church, within our relationships between our Christian brothers and sisters, you love with patience. Now think about this. This goes against human nature. It really does. It goes against human nature. Human nature does not like to sit back silently while we are being actively wronged. And let's just assume for a moment that our anger, our bitterness, our confusion with other people is because we were genuinely wronged. Sometimes we're angry at people and they didn't actually wrong us and we are wrong. But let's just assume for the moment that we have been actually genuinely wronged. Human nature does not like to sit back and say nothing and do nothing, right? Human nature says, you wrong me, I wrong you. I strike back, and I strike back quicker and harder than you struck me. Right? That's human nature. But Paul says, no, love is patient in that it will take without retaliation. It will take, and it will take without quitting. Now, again, I don't want to point this out. There's a difference, and let me just say this. There is a difference between being actively wronged and staying silent out of fear of the consequences if we speak up, and being actively wronged and staying silent because you are genuinely just loving the one wronging you. There's a difference between the two, right? I think you could, on the outside, I think it could look like you're having the same response with vastly different heart in each. But here Paul says, no, love is patient. Paul has been admonishing the Corinthian church for this very thing. In chapter 6, if you remember back in chapter 6, the Corinthians were suing one another for various matters. And Paul says this, he says, now therefore there is utterly a fault among you because you go to law with one another. And he says, why do you not rather take wrong? That's a big statement. He goes on to say, why do you not rather suffer yourselves to be defrauded? He says, why are you going to court? Why are you going to law and to law courts amongst Christian brothers and sisters? You ought to love each other with patience. First of all, you ought to love each other to the effect to say that even if I'm wronged, that's fine. I can take that and still love you back. And even if it escalates beyond that, you should be able to not have to go to a law court. You should be able to settle it amongst one another because why? You should love one another. Love each other with patience. And so Paul here says you should be willing to be defrauded by these people. And what? Still take it and still love in return. Now, of course, in all of these, you'll see, in all of these, Christ is the ultimate example. Because nobody has ever loved perfectly as Christ did. But Christ is the ultimate example of this. I want you to think about this. As Christ is being crucified, actively being put to death, what does he say? He cries out and he says, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Friends, I'll tell you what, there's never been a more patient love than the love of Christ. When he was writing to Timothy, Paul actually gives his own salvation as an example of the patient love of Christ. He tells Timothy, he says, howbeit for this cause I obtained mercy, that in me first Jesus Christ might show forth all long-suffering, for a pattern to them which should hereafter believe on him to life everlasting. He says, let my salvation be a pattern to everybody who comes after me, everybody who's saved after me, of the patient and long-suffering love of Christ. And it makes sense, right? We read of the life of Paul, Saul at that time, before his conversion. And what was it? As we saw a couple of Sunday nights ago, Paul was, to use the words of Acts, wreaking havoc upon the church. Right? When Paul was saved, what was he doing? He was on his way to Damascus with orders to gather up every Christian he could find and arrest them and bring them back to Jerusalem for the Jews to do whoever knows what they were going to do. Right? And so he was doing all these kinds of things. So Paul says, God was, or Christ was actively long-suffering, and let his love towards me, let my own salvation be an example of the long-suffering, the patient love of Christ. And so again, I don't think there's a better way he could have started this list. And think about this. Again, think about our relationships with one another. Think about, for those who have been saved for a long time, think about the various conflicts that you've had through the years with other Christians. And listen, it happens. It's going to happen, right? I mean, we're all human. As we talked about last week, we all have that sin nature that still abides and will abide until we get to heaven, and it flares up, And so those conflicts, they're going to come. Think about how, not only did how they act, but how did you act? How did you react? Did you love them patiently? Or did we vindictively strike back? Again, this is, and don't think for a second this morning that I'm preaching at you. I'm talking to all of us this morning, myself included. This is a convicting passage of Scripture. If anybody leaves this morning thinking, you know what, I don't think he was talking about me at all today, you're not listening. This passage of Scripture will convict every Christian, if we're being honest with ourselves. And so, first of all, charity suffers long. Secondly, and is kind. It's patient, it's kind. Now, interestingly here, the root of the Greek word here used for kind means to be useful. And so when he says kind, he has in mind a useful kindness. And so if love being patient and that it will take anything, it seems that love being kind means that it will give anything. And so you really can see that the patience and kindness here are two sides of the same coin. And so these are kind of opposite characteristics that both come from the root of love. One will take, one will give. Now again, this was another issue that the Corinthians have struggled with. Back in chapter 11, Paul says, when you come together therefore into one place, he says, this is not to eat the Lord's Supper, for in eating everyone taketh before other his own supper, and one is hungry and another is drunken. If you remember back when we were talking in chapter 11, with all the various problems that they were having with regard to the Lord's Supper, one of which is they had those who had and those who had not, and those who had not were coming to the suppers where they're supposed to be taking a communion together, and were leaving just as hungry as when they got there, because those that had were gathering everything up and eating before they could even get there sometimes. They had no kindness. They had no care for those in their own body. Paul, again, to the Ephesians, in the same chapter, he brings out a similar thought. He says, and be you kind one to another, tenderhearted, forgiving one another, even as God for Christ's sake hath forgiven you. And so again, patience takes, kindness gives. I want you to turn to Luke chapter 6, because the Gospel of Luke brings out both of these concepts, both the concept of true love being a giving love, and Christ as the supreme example of a giving love. And so Luke chapter 6, and we'll see this together. Luke chapter 6, start reading in verse number 27. And here we read this. He says, but I say unto you, and this is Jesus speaking, but I say unto you which hear, love your enemies. Do good to them which hate you. Bless them that curse you, and pray for them which despisefully use you. And unto him that smiteth thee on the one cheek, offer the other. And him that taketh away thy cloak, forbid not to take thy coat also. Give to every man that asketh of thee, and of him that taketh away thy good, ask them not again. And as you would that men should do to you, do you also to them likewise. And he says this, for if you love them which love you, what think of you? For sinners also love those that love them. And if you do good to them, do good to you, again, what think of you? For sinners also do the same. He says, and if you lend to them of whom you hope to receive, what think of you? For sinners also lend to sinners to receive as much again. He says, but love you your enemies, as do good, and lend, hoping for nothing again, and your reward shall be great, and you shall, look at this, and you shall be the children of the highest, for he is kind unto the unthankful and to the evil. What does he say? What is he saying? He's picturing here the kind love of Christ. Now, obviously, Christ was not just kind to those who gave kindness in return. That didn't exist. What do we just read? As Jesus is actively being crucified, forgive them. Who are the ones that Jesus was dying for? Not only the disciples, but what did the disciples do? They rejected him. They turned their tail and ran. Who was Jesus dying for? The ones crucifying him, the one putting the thorns upon his head, the one putting the nails in his hands and feet, the one taking his garments, the one spitting upon him, the ones tearing his beard out. Those are the ones for whom Jesus was dying for, not for the ones giving kindness in return, because those didn't exist. And so what does true love do? True love takes and true love gives, and not just gives to those to whom you expect to receive in return. That's not love. That's a partnership. Right? That's a contract waiting to be written. Right? I'll give you, but only if you give me back. That's not love. That may be something, but love is not what that is. And so true love, what does it do? It gives, but it also it takes, but it also gives. And so love, and again, remember we're talking about agape love here. Agape love is kind and it is patient. And then we move on to number 3. Charity suffereth long, it is kind. Charity envieth not. True love is not an envying love. Another way to say that, true love is not jealous. Jealousy is a nasty emotion. It truly is. Jealousy is a nasty emotion that we are all likely guilty of from time to time. And there's a variety of ways. There's a myriad of ways in which you and I could be jealous about something or other. Paul told the Christians earlier in the book, he says, "For yet you are carnal." He says, "For whereas there is among you envying and strife and divisions." And again he says, "Are you not carnal and walk as men?" What is he saying? There's nothing that separates you from the rest of the world. You're just as jealous as the rest of them. Envy was one of the reasons there was so much division in this body. One thing that we have seen time and time again over the first 12 chapters of this book is this was a divided group of Christians. Envy was one of those reasons. The Greek word here for envy, it gives even more of a picture of the envy, because it's not just envy. It's someone who burns or boils with envy. It's not just you're a little bit jealous. You are burning with jealousy. This isn't a slight feeling of envy, but an active hatred at the good fortune of someone else. This is destructive to a person. We read in Proverbs chapter 14, it says, "A sound heart is the life of the flesh." It says this, "But envy the rottenness of the bones." What does it tell us? Jealousy isn't just a nasty emotion. Jealousy will affect you. It will affect you bone deep, right? According to the Proverbs, it is the rottenness of the bones. Because you see, true love rejoices with others. True love is not envious. True love rejoices with others. It doesn't smile outwardly while screaming inwardly when things go well for other people. I think we're all guilty of this from time to time. How often do we get these nasty emotions swelling up within ourselves? We'll come to church and smile at somebody and tell them how thankful we are for their good fortune, and, "Oh, I'm so glad God did that for you," and then we're thinking, "Oh, why wasn't that me?" That's not love. Right? We can put on a good face from time to time, but the question is, what is our heart's desire? I want you to turn to another place and go to Philippians chapter 1, and we'll see what is really a remarkable example of this. Philippians chapter 1, starting in verse 12. Again, Paul is writing here. He says, but I would you should understand, brethren, that the things which have happened unto me, and the things which have happened to me," he's talking about being arrested, "the things which have happened to me have happened have fallen out rather under the furtherance of the gospel." He says, so that my bonds in Christ are manifest in all the palace and in all of the places. And he says this, "And many of the brethren in the Lord, waxing confident by my bonds, are much more bold to speak the word without fear." But look at verse 15. He says, "Some indeed preach Christ even of envy and strife, and some also of goodwill." He says, "The one preach Christ of contention, not sincerely, supposing to add affliction to my bonds." He says, "But the other of love, knowing that I am set for the defense of the gospel." He says, "What then? Notwithstanding every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is preached, and I therein do rejoice, yea, and will rejoice." So what is Paul saying here? He says, you know the fact. You know the situation. You know that I'm currently in bonds. I'm in chains. I'm awaiting trial. I've been arrested. And because of my arrest, there are Christians out there who have basically seen, hold on, if Paul's not out there preaching, you know what? There's a door that's been opened, and maybe I could make a little bit of gain here. Right? Paul's been going around doing all this thing, and everybody knows who Paul is. Paul has notoriety. Paul has power. Paul has all this stuff. And if he can't do it anymore, somebody's got to do it. I have to stand up. Maybe I'll get all that power. Maybe I'll get all that prestige. And so they start preaching, not because they love the Lord, not because they love the gospel, but because they love their self. And look what Paul says here. He says some of them are doing it just to add problems to the problems that already exist for me. They're doing it because they don't like me or for whatever reason. He says, and you know what I could do? I could get bitter. I could get mad. I could pray that God just strike them down dead. But you know what's happening? For whatever reason, the gospel is being preached. And for whatever reason behind them, I'm not going to judge them. God's going to judge them. I'm just going to rejoice that the gospel is being preached. And so Paul, if anybody had the proper time to be angry and bitter and envious of a person, here I am in chains, not able to get out there and do what I love to do. And here they are for false pretense and all these bad reasons getting to go do all the things that I was doing. But no, I'm just going to rejoice. I'm just going to rejoice. I'm just going to rejoice that the gospel is out there being preached. You see, Paul's love for both Christ and the gospel would not allow him to envy that others were gaining at his expense. And again, as with all of these, there was certainly no envy in the life of Christ. He himself, Jesus said this, I can of mine own self do nothing. As I hear, I judge, and my judgment is just, because I seek not mine own will, but the will of the Father which hath sent me. What is he saying? I'm not here to glorify myself. All of these things that I've done, you know what Christ could have done? Christ could have amassed, and now he did amass a great following, but think about the things that Christ could have gathered in this life, being able to do the things that Christ did. Every worldly pleasure imaginable he could have had at the drop of a hat. This is exactly what Satan tried to tempt him with. But what was his whole purpose? What was his whole ministry? It's not to glorify me. It's not to uplift me. It's to glorify the Father. So I'm here to do the will of the one that sent me. At another time he said, I seek not mine own glory. Not an envious bone in his body. He could have said, you know what? God the Father, I'm the one here doing all the work. Why don't I get the glory? His whole ministry was to point others to the one who sent him. So again, what do we see? Love is patient. Love is kind. Love is not jealous. Let's continue on. Love is patient. Love is kind. Love is not envious. Still there in verse 4. Charity vaunteth not itself. It does not vaunt itself. Now, simply what this means, it's not boastful. Love is not boastful. I'm sure we've probably all experienced this and perhaps even partaken in something like this. You're in a conversation with, several different people, and somebody tells, a story or something that happened to him, and sure enough, you know it's coming. As soon as they get done, somebody else tripping in. Well, hold on, let me tell you about what I did, right? And they try to one-up the last person, and then, just round and round it goes. Oh, that's nothing, right? Let me tell you about what I did, or that's nothing compared to what I've experienced, right? We've all been there, right? We know exactly this exact thing. But this is not love. Love does not vaunt itself. Love does not boast itself. One of the very first problems Paul addressed with the Corinthians was their boasting. He says this back in chapter 1. He says, now this I say, that every one of you saith, I am of Paul, and I have Apollos, and I have Cephas, or I have Christ. He says, is Christ divided? Was Paul crucified for you, or were you baptized in the name of Paul? Now, here's what they were doing. They were literally boasting based upon who they considered to be the leader of their particular following. This is not love, right? For what is boasting if not attempting to demean others by making yourself seem superior? Right, again, just to go back to what we were talking about earlier, those kinds of conversations. What are you trying to do? No. Here's where you think you are. Let me show you. You're really here, and I'm here. Right? That's what we're trying to do. Your story's nothing. My story's better because you're nothing, and I'm greater. Right? Now, whether or not we even realize it, that's what we're doing in those kinds of situations. Right? And again, I think we've all been there. I think we've all experienced it. And so this is exactly what we're doing. I'm going to push you down and boast myself up because I really want you to understand the gap that exists between my superiority and your inferiority. If ever there was a time to boast, if ever in the history of humanity somebody had the right to boast, it would have been Christ. And think about this. When Christ was sent before Herod, Herod basically wanted to make a circus out of Christ. But Christ had been before Pilate, and Pilate didn't want anything to do with it, so Pilate sends him to Herod, and he's before Herod, and Herod is giddy, basically. Herod's, I've been wanting to talk to you. Do a miracle. Perform for me. But you know what Christ could have done? Easily. He could have boasted about his power. He could have boasted about his omnipotence. He could have performed any miracle that Herod could have even possibly imagined. You know what else he could have done? He could have gotten out scot-free just by blowing Herod's mind with his ability. But yet, here's what we read. It says, and when Herod saw Jesus, he was exceeding glad, for he was desirous to see him of a long season, because he had heard many things of him, and he had hoped to have seen some miracle done by him. And then he questioned him in many words, but he, speaking of Jesus, he answered him nothing. Again, if ever there was a time to boast, that was it. Christ didn't do it. Answered him nothing. Philippians 2:3 says, let nothing be done through strife or vainglory, but in lowliness of mind, let each esteem other better than themselves. Again, these are hard verses. These are hard truths. I understand When I stand up here and I say these things, these are convicting things, and that's as they ought to be. I'll say more about that in just a second. Let's continue on. So charity suffereth long, it is kind, it envieth not, it vaunteth not itself, it is not puffed up. It is not puffed up. Love is not prideful. So this word puffed up, it speaks of pride, it speaks of arrogance. We've talked at length about the issue of pride in the Corinthian church. We've seen it almost every chapter. So this would be the attitude of the boaster. You could say that this is the inward action that leads to the outward action of boasting. Right? The boaster boasts because he has a prideful heart. Right? That's what leads to it. And so this is, again, very much related to boasting, because the boaster boasts because of being puffed up. And so, as I said, this is unquestionably a tremendous problem in the Corinthian church. Now, this is an interesting fact. The word that is used here, when he says that charity is not puffed up, the word that is used here is only used 7 times in the New Testament. 6 of them are found in this letter. And so of the 7 times the word is used in the New Testament, 6 of them are Paul's describing the Corinthian church. We've spoken many times about the issue that this church was having with pride. In Romans chapter 12, verse 10, it says, "Be kindly affectioned one to another with brotherly love and honor, preferring one another." True love esteems others. Now, I've mentioned this in the past, but I think it's worth saying again. That does not mean, when we talk about being humble and esteeming another, that does not mean that in order to esteem another, you have to think less of yourself. That's not what we say. It just means that you're there to edify others and not self. Jesus said in Matthew 20, verse 28, he says, "Even as the Son of Man came not to be ministered unto, but to minister, and to give his life a ransom for many." Christ loved with the perfect love, right? We know that. We understand that. And he certainly esteemed others higher than himself, but he did not demean himself. Christ did not think less of himself in order to esteem others. Right? Christ knew exactly who he was. He didn't think less of himself. And so when we think of humility, I think sometimes people get the wrong idea about this. It's not saying I've got to demean myself so that I can uplift others. No, think of yourself what you are. Be honest with yourself. But just edify others and not your own self. This is one of the biggest problems that they were having in the area of spiritual gifts. Again, why are we even talking about love? It's because they had so many problems with their spiritual gifts. The gifts are for edifying. That's why they are given. You have the gifts that you have in order to edify and uplift the church, to build up those around you. But all they wanted to do was to edify self, right? They all wanted to speak tongues. Why? Because tongues was kind of this miraculous thing, and you'd get all the notoriety. Oh, man, look at that guy, speaking all these languages that he doesn't know. That's amazing. That's incredible, right? Let's lift him up. And so they all wanted this gift of tongues because it was, it was this more miraculous kind of thing, and it was this amazing thing, and everybody loved it. It was a wonderful thing to see. And so they were doing it to edify self and not others. And so true love does the opposite. Howard Jr. says, "Love is constructive. It builds up the building. The puffed up spirit blows up the building." There's a big difference in the two. Making our way right along. Verse 5, true love, it says, "does not behave itself unseemly." It doesn't behave itself unseemly. Now, this is an interesting one. This word here speaks of this. Love does nothing that would be considered shameful. Love does nothing that would be considered shameful. Now, this has a wide range of application. This word here, this has a wide range. This has a wide range of application from everything to social decorum to that of sexual sin. And so we're talking about a wide range of things here. Now obviously, this church had a lot of problems with regards to the latter. Paul told them back in chapter 5 that they were doing things in that area that is not so much as named among the Gentiles. You remember back in chapter 5, that was that a man would have his father's wife. However, even in smaller matters of decency, our conduct matters, because what does it do? Our conduct, even when we talk about just things of decorum, our conduct shows a genuine care for others. We act in accordance to proper societal norms, not just because we want to fit in, but because we want to care and defer to others. There's a reason why, I'm trying to figure out the best way to say this. There's a reason that we don't act a fool around other people. It's not because we want to be prideful, we want people to think of less of us. It's because we want to show reverence to other people. There's a reason, all right, where things like that are some things are considered indecorum, some things are considered decent, other things aren't. I'll quote Matthew Henry. He said, "Charity is careful not to pass the bounds of decency. It does nothing indecorous, nothing that in the common account of men is base or vile. Charity will do nothing that misbecomes it." And so the reason why I like this one is because it shows us the vast array of the characteristics that define true love. Right? We've already talked about the patience and the kindness and the lack of pride and arrogance and all these things. But also, you know what true love does? True love just gives reverence to people around you. True love just acts right. All right? True love doesn't bring itself a bad name. You could say, honestly, that this particular characteristic is the love of common courtesy. That's really what Paul's talking about, the love of common courtesy. Now, many times Christ had conversations and experiences with people who others had written off as deserving no decency. And there's a lot of these that could be given. But the one that I kind of always gravitate to, the many examples that could be given, there's a story in Mark chapter 1. In Mark chapter 1, verse 40, here's what we read. It says, "And there came a leper to him, beseeching him, and kneeling down to him, and saying unto him, If thou wilt, thou canst make me clean. And it says, And Jesus, moved with compassion, put forth his hand and touched him, and saith unto him, I will, be thou clean." Now, the reason why I love this story so much is because you got to understand the way that lepers were treated. Right? Lepers, and we understand there were actual health reasons why this was the case. But lepers were, if you want to consider an outcast, right? This is where we even understand the term of an outcast, is the way that these lepers were treated. They were outcasts. They had to be. We understand that for health reasons. But we understand that also it got to the point where if a leper in this particular time even got close to somebody who was not a leper, right, they'd have to shout out, "Unclean! Unclean! Don't get close to me! Unclean!" And so they were very much not just the outcast from a societal perspective, but people looked down upon them. They were treated horribly, right? And so the reason why I gravitate to this is because not only does Jesus heal this man, not only does it tell us that Jesus moved with compassion to him, but you know what Jesus did? Jesus did something for this man that had probably never happened since the day that he had leprosy. Jesus touched him. Jesus placed his hand upon this man and touched him, moved with compassion. You know what Jesus did? He showed a little bit of decency to this man. Now, again, I understand why other people didn't touch him. That's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying that other people should have come up and just put their hands all over the lepers. That's not what I'm saying. But we know the way that these men were treated. And to say that they had a lack of common courtesy would be understating it. And so Jesus did something for this man that had not happened in a long time. He touched him, moved with compassion upon this man. And so here's a man who, because of this disease, had certainly experienced a great deal of rudeness, a tremendous lack of courtesy. So Jesus had compassion upon him and showed his love with a physical touch upon this man. Now again, this isn't the only time that Jesus did something like this. Jesus acted with a social decorum in all situations to all people. He treated people with common courtesy who others had written off. You think of the woman at the well, and his disciples they couldn't believe that Jesus was even talking to this woman. What did he do? He didn't overlook her sin. Didn't just love her by not mentioning anything bad. No, he was honest with her. He was honest with her about her sin. But you know what he did? He talked to her. He had a conversation with her. He had just common courtesy for this woman. And it changed her life. And so true love is a love that just has social decorum. It has common courtesy. Let's look at another. Does not behave itself unseemly, seeketh not her own. Seeketh not her own. Love does not seek its own. True agape love seeks the good of others, not the good of self. Paul told them, the Corinthians back in chapter 10, "Let no man seek his own, but every man another's wealth," or that word wealth referring to the advantage or goodwill. Right? Let everybody seek the goodwill of others. Now this isn't necessarily an issue of pride as it is an issue of selfishness. Okay, so there's a slight difference here. And so it seeks not her own. Again, not so much in the sense of pride, although that may be inherent in this, but it's not so much pride as it is selfishness. It's not so much that I just think I'm better than everybody else. I just want all the stuff and not others to have it. Doesn't matter if I think I'm better than you. I just want to have the stuff that you don't. And so selfishness in all of us starts at a very young age. And if you don't think that's true, you get two toddlers and you put them in a room together and you give them one toy. And you will see selfishness put on a stage at a very early age. Selfishness is the opposite of love. It only thinks about self to the neglect of all others. Richard Linsky, a commentator, said this: cure selfishness and you have just replanted the Garden of Eden. I like that statement. Paul goes on to tell them later in that chapter 10, he says, even as I please all men in all things, not seeking mine own profit, but the profit of many, that they may be saved. So Paul, again, gives himself as an example here. Everywhere Jesus went, he was accosted, he was pressed upon by the multitudes. You read through the Gospels, it says sometimes he wasn't even able to sit in a house and eat a meal because there was just people just thronging the house where he was at. However, we still read this in Matthew chapter 9. It says, and Jesus went about all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues, preaching the gospel of the kingdom, and healing every sickness and every disease among the people. There is no telling the physical toll that the human side of Jesus took. And make no mistake about it, Jesus was fully God, we understand that, but he was also fully man. He got tired. He felt the physical toll of all the travel, of all the things that was placed upon him as a man. And so there's no telling the physical toll upon the humanity of Jesus to be constantly called upon everywhere he went, to never be able to do anything without people accosting him, calling for miracles, calling for food, just wanting a moment with this miracle worker. And yet Christ, in his love for the people, gave with no hint of selfishness. Now, we understand that there were times where he got away and fasted, and he did that for his own needs, but never once do we have a story where Jesus was accosted by somebody with a miracle, and Jesus snapped. He said, you know what? I'd like just a moment to myself. How many of us, if we were in that same situation, would have a crowd running at us and us sprinting that way because we're just tired of it all? And yet for 3 years, Jesus endured this. And what do we read? Constantly in the Gospels, everywhere that Jesus went. It's not that he's getting tired of it all. What do we read? Over and over and over again, Jesus was moved with compassion. He looked at these crowds, and you know what he didn't think? Would they just leave me alone? No, he thought, I love them, and I'm going to give everything I can. Not a selfish moment. The very next verse, in Matthew 9, it says, but when he saw the multitudes, he was moved with compassion on them because they fainted and were scattered abroad as sheep having no shepherd. He didn't think, you know what, I'd like a moment just to breathe. I just want to get away for a minute. I understand for his own purposes, he did from time to time go into solitude for fasting and prayer, but not for selfishness. But never do we read of him, again, just snapping on his people. No, what he said, they need a shepherd. And he knows he's that shepherd. A short conclusion this morning, because we're not done. We've read 7. We've got 8 more to look at next week. But I want you to think of the 7 that we've already read, and I want you to understand, as amazing as this list is, we're only halfway done. We're only halfway through with the characteristic to define a true biblical love. And again, I understand this is a convicting list, and again, if we're all honest with ourselves, we could say, I've already failed. I'm only halfway through, and I've already failed. And friends, listen, that's the point. Because what does this list do if not define for us how Christ loved us? A perfect love. A love that you and I ought to strive for, but a love that is, at this point in time, impossible for you and I to attain. And so, you know what? You ought to feel like you've fallen short. You know what that ought to do? It ought to grow our love for Christ to understand that that is how he loved us. And so if nothing else has happened this morning, I hope that this list would show us just how far we fall short and make us stand in awe at the love that Christ has for each and every one of us. Let's pray.